Hello friends. In today's episode we will share the story about mysterious disappearance of Sodder children. George Sodder was born in Italy in 1895. In those years his name was Giorgio Soddu. When George was 13 years old, he immigrated to America with his older brother. After coming to the United States, George Sodder chose to live in the state of Pennsylvania. He soon found a job with the Pennsylvania Railroad and began working as a porter, so to speak. After 2 years, he had had enough of working under harsh conditions, and upon his friend's advice, he traveled to Virginia to work as a chauffeur. In time he saved a certain amount of money. 7 years later he was the boss of a transportation company. 2 years later he married Jenny, an Italian girl who worked as a warehouse manager in his company. George and Jenny bought a plot of land near Fayetteville, where Italians were mostly concentrated, and built a 2-story house on the land, which would become the couple's new home. George and Jenny welcomed their first child in 1923. George was a well-connected man, a trait that helped him achieve considerable success in his business, but he was also a dissident. He harshly criticized Mussolini and spoke openly about his wrongdoings. This caused him to get into harsh arguments with his Italian friends within his close circle, and he became a persona non grata in that neighborhood. The last member of the Sodder family was born in 1943. It was Sylvia, the 10th child of the Sodder family. Soon a son of the Sodder family joined the army to serve in World War II. In April 1945, Mussolini and his mistress were executed, which devastated Mussolini sympathizers in America. Shortly after the Mussolini affair, an insurance salesman came to the Sodder family home and made a good offer, but the Sodders had no intention of insuring the house, and after receiving a negative response, the salesman told the Sodders that their house would go up in smoke. The salesman said that his comments about Mussolini had angered the Italians in the neighborhood and that they could harm the Sodder family at any time. Before the Sodder family could recover from the shock, another similar incident occurred. Threatening letters were left in their mailbox. The family later claimed that unidentified men harassed their young children on their way to school and followed them to school in a car. The Sodder family's darkest night was Christmas Eve, 1945, when Marion, the eldest Sodder daughter, was working in a warehouse downtown. Martha, Jenny, and Betty were so excited they kept telling their mother they wanted to stay up late. Their mother said they could go to bed as late as they wanted after she had tethered the cows outside in the barn. The father, George, and his 2 older sons were working that day, so they came home in the middle of the night. 16-year-old John Jr. was already in bed by the time they arrived, and shortly afterward the older daughter picked up her brothers and put them to bed. Jenny got out of bed and went downstairs to answer the phone. It was a woman, and she was laughing on the phone. She had a glass in her hand, and she clinked it 2 or 3 times while she was on the phone. The pointless phone call lasted 2 minutes and ended when the woman hung up, saying she had the wrong number. Jenny was getting ready to go back to bed when she realized that the lights and curtains were still on, and Marion was asleep on the couch in the living room. Jenny closed the curtains and the light and went to bed. It was only half an hour later that Jenny was startled awake by a sudden noise from the roof of the house. But then, when there was no more noise, she went back to bed. Half an hour after that, smoke filled the room where Jenny was sleeping. She got up in a hurry to look for the source of the smoke and found that the telephone line and the fuse box in the room George used as an office were on fire. Jenny immediately woke her eldest son and her husband George. They were followed by 4 other children. Everyone was running out of the house in fear, screaming for the children in other rooms. 5 of the Sodder children made it out, but 5 were still inside. There was no sound from the children in the house, and no one could go upstairs because the stairs were in flames. Shortly after leaving the house, it was impossible to get inside and rescue the children. John Sodder told reporters after the incident that he had gone up to the attic and called out to his siblings, but later changed his narrative and said that he had not seen them, only called downstairs. In that moment of panic, Marion looked around for a phone to call the fire brigade but couldn't find one. But luckily a passing motorist saw the fire and went to a nearby pub to call the fire brigade. But strangely the fire brigade didn't arrive for a long time. When they didn't arrive, George decided to climb into the house with the help of a ladder. He cut his arm as he reached the ceiling. Meanwhile, his sons were trying to climb into the house with another ladder. When George reached the attic, he found something he hadn't expected. The children were nowhere to be found, presumably having fled elsewhere in panic. George then climbed back up to the house with the help of 2 pickup trucks he used at work, but again the children were nowhere to be seen. For nearly an hour the Sodders watched their home burn to the ground moment by moment, and the fire brigade was still nowhere to be seen. George and Jenny had come to accept that their son was dead, and they stood helplessly on the floor, focused on a fixed point, saying nothing. The fire department was called many times that day by neighbors, but there was no response from the fire department. The next day, Fire Chief Morris said that he could not find a driver to drive the fire truck, so he could not send one. When the fire department arrived on the scene, they immediately went inside the house, but there was little that could be done. The basement was completely covered in ashes, and it took until 10 a.m. to find any trace of the children. According to the police, it was impossible for all traces to have disappeared in such a short period of time. There was something else hidden in this case. The teams that arrived at the scene removed the Sodder family from the house in order to conduct a proper investigation. At the end of the investigation, it was determined that fire had been caused by faulty electrical wiring. But this explanation did not satisfy anyone. The reaction to their opposition to Mussolini, the letters they had recently received, and the fact that they were told by an insurance worker that their house would be burned down removed all question marks about the incident for the Sodder family. But where were their children? Among those brought to court as part of the investigation was the insurance worker, who told the family that their house would burn down, but the lack of evidence prevented him from being punished. The Sodders tried to readjust to life, but it was going to be very difficult. The Christmas lights were left on for a long time during the fire, and the Sodders filed a new lawsuit, arguing that if there had been a problem with the electricity, the Christmas lights would have gone out. Weeks later, a telephone repairman came forward and said that the fire was not electrical as it was thought to be. It was a 6-foot-tall man who climbed up the pole and cut the wires. The Sodder family did not rebuild the house, but turned the land into a memorial garden. The state put photos of the children on some roads in the neighborhood and offered a reward for anyone who found them. At the same time, a flyer was printed and distributed everywhere. Shortly afterwards, a woman who ran a hotel claimed to have seen the children. She said they had come to their hotel with 2 women and 2 men who looked Italian. The Italians had left the hotel early the next morning, although she could not remember the exact date. Later, a woman living in Louisiana said the children were staying in a convent. 20 years later, a few clues about the children were found, and the Sodder family received mysterious letters with Louis' picture in them, identifying himself as Louis. The letter read, "This is Louis Sodder. I love my brother Frankie." A man who allegedly lived in Kentucky around the same time looked a lot like Louis. He was 34 years old. Louis would have been in his 30s if he had lived, so all the pieces fell into place. George immediately traveled to Kentucky, and with the help of the police he reached the man, but the man denied all the allegations. George Sodder died in 1969. The Sodder brothers also spent years trying to solve the case, even using social media to publicize it half a century later. Many believed that their brother was still alive, others that he had been kidnapped that night and taken to Italy. More than half a century later, this mystery remains unsolved.